The views and opinions expressed on the One Mark podcast are those of the authors or guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of One Mark. Any content provided by our guests or authors are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.
Which rights belong to everyone living in South Africa and which rights belong to only citizens?
Cannot be inciting violence. You can't be propagating for war or violence against other people. So as much as you have the right to express yourself, you also have the responsibility to ensure that in expressing yourself, you don't violate other people's rights.
Hello, Dumelang, Absheni, Sanbonani, Lochani, Molweni, Khoyadag. Welcome to the One Mark podcast, where we delve into real conversations about civil rights education. I am one of your hosts, Innocent Mohammed, Karibe ya Motswana mo Afrika Borwa. I am thrilled to have you join us as we embark on this beautiful educational journey. As usual, I am not by myself. I am with my co-host.
Hello everyone and welcome. Siyanamukela to another episode of the One Mark podcast. My name is Mbali Mota. Ntombi Mswati Lambulani Njebenkom, all the way from Mpumalanga. Thank you for joining us in today's episode. We want this podcast to be a safe space for everyone to engage openly about civic education and service delivery issues. We want to collaborate with people from different backgrounds. We hope to start conversations in your homes, in your cars, or wherever you are.
On today's episode, we will be focusing on the chapter 2 of the Constitution. If you did not watch our previous episode on the Constitution, please do so and then come right back here where we talk about chapter 2. The Bill of Rights outlines the different groups of human rights in South Africa. According to the Bill of Rights, everyone has the right to life, equality, and human dignity. There are also civil rights that include the right to freedom, security, and privacy.
Indeed, the Bill of Rights also contains political rights. These are rights to start or join a political party of your choice, the right to vote, and also to stand for elections. It also includes socio-economic rights. These rights talk about basic resources, opportunities, and services that people need to lead a dignified life. Such human rights were violated under the apartheid government. What the Bill of Rights does is to protect these rights and ensure that our human rights are protected. To give us a broader understanding of the Bill of Rights is lawyer Ms. Princess Ka-Siboto, a legal expert in human rights. Good morning, Ka-Siboto. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning, I'm well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. Could you kindly just introduce yourselves to our viewers at home?
Thank you. So my name is Princess Ka-Siboto. I am a human rights lawyer. I've been practicing in this area for a little under 10 years now, and I'm happy to be here to speak more about the Bill of Rights.
I'm happy to have you.
We are indeed happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mbali and I have touched on some of the human rights groups, but I want you to walk us through which rights belong to everyone living in South Africa and which rights belong to only citizens.
So the Bill of Rights applies to everyone in South Africa, regardless of who they are and where they come from. The only rights that are limited to citizens of South Africa would be rights such as the right to vote, because it specifically requires that one be a citizen of South Africa.
Okay, this is what the Bill of Rights says. Everyone has inherent dignity, and their dignity to be respected and protected. What does it mean for an ordinary citizen or someone living in South Africa who doesn't have any knowledge about the Constitution of South Africa and also the the rights contained within it?
So dignity applies to everything that makes you a human being who is capable of living a good life in South Africa. So regardless of who you are, by virtue of you being a human being, you have inherent dignity. It's something that is not given to you by anyone. It's something that you have by virtue of being a human being.
Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about socio-economic rights in South Africa. The South African government has played such a significant role in addressing these rights since the end of apartheid regime. What are the key socio-economic rights?
Okay, so the key socioeconomic rights, and there are a few, I would say, are rights such as right to housing, right to health, right to education, and right to move about freely without any restriction. So those would be the key rights which were previously restricted under the apartheid regime, but have since now been given to everyone.
Okay, I see. And are there any policies or initiatives that the government has implemented to address these needs?
Yes, so there are social welfare programs that the government has initiated. People who are unable to meet the basic needs of their own households have access to grants. There are disability grants, there are child support grants, and these are all initiatives that the state has implemented to ensure that they provide the means to provide some level of dignity to those who may not necessarily be able to cater for themselves.
Okay, and in your view, I mean, we know these conversations, we've had debates about social grants in South Africa. We do know, and thank you for highlighting, especially the disability one as well, because I mean, if you're disabled, you are unable, or physically challenged, you are unable to work. How effective are these initiatives?
Well, I think in today's economy, we can all agree that they're not really that effective. I think the highest grant that people receive might either be the grant afforded to people who are looking after foster children, the foster care grant. I think it's sitting at just over 1,000 rand, and I mean, I think everybody knows how expensive everything is. You can't even do much with 1,000 rand. But some people would still argue that it's better than nothing. So it's debatable about whether or not they go far enough, but it's still something.
Yeah.
I'd like to shift our conversation to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In simple terms, I know that it outlines the freedoms and also the rights that everyone is entitled to. But what is it in simple terms for someone who doesn't know what it is? Can you please just walk us through what is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Okay, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document that was put together by the United Nations in 1948. This was after World War II, and I think everybody knows about Hitler and what happened, the Holocaust. Yes. So after that, there was a decision made by members of the United Nations, which is comprised of a number of countries across the world, where it was decided that there's certain rights that are applicable and ought to be imbued or given to all people, regardless of who they are. And these rights are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it serves as a framework for how people ought to interact with each other and how governments ought to treat their citizens to ensure that the injustices that occurred during the wars are not repeated.
Okay, it says universal. Does that mean it includes everyone all around the world, or does it just specifically look at South Africa?
Universal Declaration refers to everyone in the world. By virtue of you being a human being alive on this earth, it applies to you.
So wherever I find myself in the world,
It's
I have this
applicable.
right.
Yes.
Definitely right. Okay, I just need to understand something.
Yeah.
So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that addresses rights across the world, right? And then each and every country has a unique Bill of Rights. So which is superior?
So the Universal Declaration, we would say, is the bigger framework, and then each of the countries have their own bills of rights or charters that they would have developed, which seek to mirror what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has proposed to be the rights that ought to be applicable across the board. So our Bill of Rights, for example, is predominantly modeled on the Universal Declaration of Rights. So, yes, so when you read our Bill of Rights, there are a lot of rights that you'll pick up which are found in the Universal Declaration of Rights.
Okay, I see. Um, Princess, ke kopa o re fe maybe like an example of rights in the universal. I'm very interested in the Universal Declaration. Maybe just one or two that we can highlight.
Okay, so the right to life
Yes. Okay.
definitely appears in the Universal Declaration, and it appears in our Bill of Rights. The right of freedom and security of the person, specifically the right not to be tortured, it appears in the Universal Declaration of Rights, and it appears in our Bill of Rights as well. And the right to dignity as well, it appears in equality, appears in the Universal Declaration, also appears in our Bill of Rights as well.
Fantastic.
You've mentioned other rights being superior to other rights, right? What I would like to know is what happens then when there is a conflict of these rights? What happens when, for instance, one of my rights conflicts with that of Inus? Is there a mechanism of making sure that these rights don't conflict with each other?
Definitely. I think conflict of rights is inevitable by virtue of people being different and people having different experiences. So, an example I can think of, for example, is the right to freedom of religion. Everybody is entitled in South Africa to practice whatever religion they subscribe to. So, I don't know, when I was growing up, it was common practice for assembly to say the Lord's Prayer before you start your classes. But now it's been done away with because there's an explicit understanding that there's a possibility that within the school body you might not necessarily have everyone being Christian, and subjecting people to be a part of the Lord's Prayer when, for example, they're Muslim or Hindu or practice another religion could be a violation of their right. So in those aspects, the balancing act would be, we're not saying Christians cannot practice their faith. We're just saying in spaces where there are a broader differentiation of people, then we need to have some level of understanding that perhaps prioritizing the Lord's Prayer over something else ought to be something that we take into account. So as far as I'm aware, in certain schools, they don't say the Lord's Prayer in school anymore, because the understanding is that now we are a secular state and there are people of different religions and faiths, so we can't just be seen to be prioritizing one or the other. And where people find themselves in a situation where, for example, a particular religion is being practiced, there's nothing that precludes them from not participating. It wouldn't be seen as a slight, for example.
Right. I know that there are organizations that promote and protect human rights. But for this particular discussion, I want to highlight the South African Human Rights Commission. Please tell us, like an organization like that, what is their role?
So the South African Human Rights Commission is colloquially known as a Chapter 9 institution. And what that means is that it's found in Chapter 9 of the Constitution. Yeah, it's one of a few institutions which were created to support constitutional democracy. Its particular mandate is found in Section 184 of the Constitution. And basically, that institution has been established to promote respect for and the recognition of human rights. So they play quite a wide role. They can educate on human rights. So what you guys are doing here is something that the Human Rights Commission also does. They can also litigate in courts where there has been an instance where rights have been violated, and they also can advise state institutions and government departments on how to align certain policies with human rights.
Fantastic. I love the fact that you answer questions before I ask. Almost like you're reading my mind. I love that. But I wanted to take us now to, are there any other organizations? I mean, you mentioned that the South African Human Rights Commission is a section of the Constitution. Are there any other organizations maybe that also help that, we can also look into and see the work that they do to promote and protect human rights?
Definitely. I mean, just at the level of state institutions, there's the public protector, there is the Commission for Gender Equality, there is the Commission on Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Rights. I always get that long because it's incredibly long. It's also in chapter 9. And there are also a number of non-governmental organizations. There are many, and they all advocate around particular rights. Some are specialists in housing rights, for example. Others are specialists in children's rights. Some are specialists in the Section 27 rights, which is food, water, access to health. So for most of the rights in the Bill of Rights, there is an organization that would agitate specifically around them. So I don't want to name, because just now I exclude others, and then it's like, why didn't you mention us?
Our president actually made a speech, and he mentioned that gender-based violence in South Africa is actually the second pandemic after COVID-19. And it's an ongoing struggle, it's an ongoing challenge. Are there organizations that specializes in gender-based violence rights? You did mention that there are rights for children, but specifically for gender-based violence. Has there been any established?
There are quite a number. From the top of my head, the most prominent one that I can think of is POA. I think they're also quite prominent. Most people know about them. Then there's also Sonke Gender Justice. They do a lot of work around protecting women's rights and promoting basically mechanisms and measures that women can take to get themselves out of situations which are detrimental to them. I'm sure there are many others that I forget, but those are the two prominent ones that I can think of. And as mentioned, insofar as institutions are concerned, there is the Commission for Gender Equality, which is specifically designed to advocate for gender equality.
Okay. Do you have anything to say to the rocks, the women, Bogodos of South Africa?
There's so much to say. But I think as women, we should really be proud of ourselves. I mean, it's so wonderful to see that I'm part of a women-led production. And it's nice to see young women, engaging in issues such as this, because the pervasive societal view is that women aren't interested in things like this, and I think this is proving that wrong. And that goes a long way in shaping where future generations are going to go. Women are a force, women are here to stay, and women are change makers. We are leaders, and there's absolutely nothing we cannot do. And I applaud all of you guys for what you started.
Thank you so much.
Section 36 of the Constitution, I actually like how you're saying all of the
Yes,
sections.
it's the section.
So I'm just going to follow suit. Section 36 of the Constitution talks about the limitation clause. When will the decision to limit one's rights be taken? And are there any other rights that are never limited?
Okay, so I'll start with the last one. So insofar as rights that can never be limited, I don't think we in South Africa have such rights. By virtue of its wording, Section 36 specifically says the rights in the Bill of Rights can be limited. So that implies that there aren't any rights that can never be limited. But insofar as Section 36 is concerned, as much as we all have inviolable rights, which means they cannot be violated, it doesn't mean those rights cannot be limited. An example of when our rights could be limited, I think the recent one that everyone would resonate with is under lockdown during the COVID pandemic, where our freedom of movement was restricted. We were all confined to our houses. We couldn't go to church, we couldn't go to mosque, we couldn't associate freely with whoever we wanted to, because there were mechanisms and laws put in place to prevent people from mingling, because that would increase the spread of COVID, and it was an emergency situation. So that is an example of when our rights in the Bill of Rights could be limited by the state.
I've heard, and you correct me if I'm wrong, now that you've mentioned emergency, in such an emergency, is there like a right specifically put aside for emergencies?
So there is a specific section, I think it's section 39, if I'm not mistaken, which speaks to states of emergency and under what circumstances a state of emergency can be called. And in those instances, there is a suspension of rights. It doesn't mean you cease to have the rights, it just means that you can't enjoy them to the extent that you would under normal times. And in that section, it specifically states that a state of emergency would be called in instances where there is war, there is insurrection, or there is some form of a public emergency that requires that the state put measures in place that will limit the enjoyment of your rights. But even in doing so, it doesn't just mean, okay, one day someone wakes up and decides, okay, I'm shutting things down. There's steps that need to be taken, laws have to be put in place, and those laws need to firstly identify the period for which they're set out, and what exactly you are not allowed to do, and everyone must be told about it, because the last thing you'd want is when you walk out of here today, you're told actually you're no longer allowed to do this, because when was that decision taken, who took that decision? So those are the sorts of things that are envisaged by that section, that as much as yes, there are instances where your rights can be limited, those limitations cannot be done arbitrarily. They need to follow some form of process, and that process must be reasonable.
Xenophobic attacks and the infringement of their rights is a serious issue in South Africa that needs to be addressed. Are there any specific rights that protect migrants in South Africa?
So migrants have the same rights as South Africans have. In South Africa, we don't have a concept of what we call refugee camps. I know maybe perhaps you've seen on TV where they show people who are asylum seekers, or people who come into other countries fleeing from conflicts, are usually put in places separate from the rest of the community. In South Africa, we don't have that concept. In our country, when people come here seeking asylum, either they're running from conflicts in their home countries, or they're seeking economic opportunities, or for whatever reason they find themselves in South Africa, we integrate them into our societies. So they live where we live, they go where we go. There's no restriction as to where they can go. So insofar as rights are concerned, the rights that are applicable to us as South African citizens are applicable to everyone by virtue of them being in the territory of South Africa. So there is nothing that precludes migrants from accessing education, for example, or accessing basic medical care. They have rights just like we all do.
Okay, so their rights are universal.
Their rights are universal.
Taking us back to that. As we draw closer to the 2024 elections, you just mentioned now that migrants have a right like any other South African or anybody that is within the South African territory. I wanted to know the right to vote. Do migrants have the right to vote?
No. I think as a starting point, migrants don't have the right to vote, but a person who is not born in South Africa can become naturalized and become a South African citizen and eventually acquire the right to vote.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Okay. All right. That's quite interesting. So now that we have started this podcast, I want to ask you a question, because we've been saying a lot of things on this, and hopefully not controversial things. We have been behaving, but I wanted to know about freedom of speech, the right of freedom to express oneself. What is that? And because we need to make sure we understand our rights here.
So I think the context of that right comes from apartheid, where you couldn't just say whatever you wanted to say without getting arrested. I mean, I think we all know the history of our political stalwarts who were arrested for expressing their views, and their views were seen as contentious and against the state policies at the time. And under the new constitution, everyone has freedom of expression. It is your constitutional right to express yourself however you feel. However, there are limitations, like we spoke about. Yes. So those limitations are contained in section 16, and it specifically tabulates that you cannot be inciting violence, you can't be propagating for war or violence against other people. So as much as you have the right to express yourself, you also have the responsibility to ensure that in expressing yourself, you don't violate other people's rights.
And Vali, do you have anything to add as we are wrapping this up?
Princess, as we draw closer to the national elections, what is your message to citizens?
Okay. I think as South Africans, we're very opinionated. We're very quick to express ourselves on social media. So I think there's no better platform to express our views than at the polls next year. So I think if you're eligible to vote, register and go there and make your voice heard, because it is your right.
And just like that, as Princess has said, exercise your right to vote. Emelang bathong ba Modimo le tsamayeng and go and vote. We are closing off today's episode, and thank you so much, Princess, for coming and enlightening us about the Bill of Rights. And I think we learned a lot.
Yes, we did.
We learned section
Quite a lot.
14, section 91,
Section 36.
section 85. We learned so much. And I think it's really very important for also you, our viewers and our listeners, to go and actually do your research and understand your rights.
Yes.
But yeah, until then,
thank you so much for joining us at home again today. We hope you're as excited as we are and you're learning as much as we do. Next time, I would encourage you to take your notes and make sure that you take much notes as you can. Until then, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure that you do not miss another episode. Follow us on social media, on One Mark, Instagram, and on Facebook. Thank you so much.
Yes, and until then, stay engaged, stay curious, and together let's unlock the power of knowing our rights. Goodbye.